some water.
All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the final main event of ASS 23, our great debate on the subject of can an AI be conscious? This is part of the 23rd annual meeting of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. It's being held here at Western University in London, Ontario, in Canada. I have a couple of announcements to make before we start. First is for those of you who are here at the meeting and are attending this event in person, the shuttles have been delayed until 10:15 because we're starting slightly late. So if we haven't finished, don't all jump up and leave at 5 to 10. You've got until 10:15 to get those shuttles. This, as I think most of you know, if you've been following us on Twitter, this event is being live streamed on the ASSC YouTube channel. Hello, anybody out there who is tuning in? Apparently we have many people around the world watching, so greetings. If you can't tune in and you hear about this on Twitter or elsewhere, this is being archived, so you can always watch it later again on the ASSC YouTube channel. I want to add that tonight's event is being sponsored by CFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. Thank you, CFAR, and you'll see shortly we have two CFAR fellows on our panel from two different CFAR programs, so I hope that shakes things up a little bit. If you would like to submit a question, either from out there in the world or from right here in the audience, there will be some opportunity for people to reach the microphones. There's one there in the middle of the room. There's one that will be roving with Michael out there on the far side. It would be preferable if you could tweet your question, if you are willing and able, with the hashtag ASSC debate, all one word, because that will be fed through to here, and I can select the best questions and put them to the panel as we go along. There's one other thing I want to do. We had a lot of thanks this afternoon for the people here from the ASSC meeting. We had a lot of thanks. I don't think anybody thanked the chair of our local organizing committee, Mel Goodale. I think he's put on an amazing meeting. Okay, thanks. So let's go. This is how everything is going to work. I'm going to begin by telling you who these people are, if you don't know already. Then I'm going to give them briefly just two to 3 minutes. I said 5, but I've now restricted it to 2 to 3 minutes for them to say whatever they like about the relationship between AI and consciousness. They can tell you what they think about it, what their position is, what they think the greatest challenges are, what they would like to talk about tonight, anything. So they get 2 to 3 minutes each to do that. Then I'm going to give them a short while to talk among themselves, just to get things going. They can challenge each other on issues that were raised in their 2 to 3 minutes, ask each other questions. We'll see how that goes. Then we're going to open it to questions, and those questions will come from Twitter directly to me, and I'll take some questions in the audience. And I hope to wrap up at around 10 o'clock in time for those of you who are here to get on the shuttle. So let me begin by telling you who our panelists for tonight are. Let's start at this end. I'm sure Hakwan Lau is no stranger to most of you who are in the room. He doesn't need much of an introduction from me. He's a professor in the Department of Psychology and the Brain Research Institute at UCLA, although I believe he also has a base in the Department of Psychology at the University of Hong Kong. Next here we have Lisa Miraki. This is the second time I've introduced Lisa today, as she was our keynote speaker first thing this morning. She's a philosopher at the University of Pennsylvania, and her research concerns issues of philosophy of mind, cognitive science, artificial intelligence, and epistemology. Sorry. Who's next? Right, Anil Seth, again, Many of you will know Anil if you've been here this week at the meeting. Anil is Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex in the UK. He's also co-director of the Sackler Centre for Consciousness Science and co-director of the Leverhulme doctoral program, which is named From Sensation and Perception to Awareness. He is also one of our CFAR fellows. He is a fellow in the Azrieli Brain, Mind and Consciousness program. Last but not least, on the far side, we have Blake Richards. And Blake is currently at the University of Toronto in the Department of Biological Sciences. He has a cross appointment to the Department of Cell and Systems Biology. But in August, he's moving to McGill, right? In December of last year, Blake was one of 29 researchers who were named in the first cohort of Canada CFAR Artificial Intelligence Chairs. Blake is also a fellow of a different CFAR program, the program in Learning in Brains and Machines. So, why don't I start at your end, Blake? Don't have any prior information about how we're going to do this. So, but why don't we start at the other end? You've got 2 to 3 minutes just to say whatever you like. Away you go.
Okay, very good. Luckily, I'm an opinionated fellow. No, okay, so when we ask the question, can an AI be conscious? My first reaction is, it depends. Now, that's a very frustrating answer, but let me clarify on what it depends. In order to make that a scientific question, you have to take on some operational definition of the word conscious. And whether or not an AI can be conscious will depend upon that definition that you adopt. So for some definitions, the answer will be yes, definitely, an AI could be conscious. For example, famously, Alan Turing, when he asked a similar question, can a machine think, noted, I need to take on an operational definition of the word think. And he said, okay, we're going to take a definition that says something thinks if it can make other people say that it thinks. So he famously postulated then the Turing test. If a computer can get people to think that it is a thinking being, then it is a thinking machine. And so if we adopt that sort of definition of consciousness, that something is conscious if people say it's conscious, then yes, an AI could be conscious. It's just an engineering challenge. Alternatively, we could take some other definition of consciousness that may or may not be applicable to a machine. If you take a definition of consciousness that is somehow embedded in the biological substrates of the humans that we typically associate with the word consciousness, then no, a machine couldn't be conscious. Alternatively, if we come up with some other definition that's based upon a mathematical concept like integrated information theory or something like that, then sure, a computer could have that. Why not? I think that what's perhaps unsatisfying for a lot of people about this answer is that what I don't think we can do is answer the question, can a machine be conscious, where we take the definition of consciousness to be the folk psychology definition that we all have. And I think that that is actually a non-scientific question. It's a pre-scientific question. We cannot address the desire that people have for identifying whether or not a machine has this amorphous thing that we all kind of feel and think about when we typically use the word consciousness. To be a scientific question, we have to adopt a definition that can operate within science. And once you do that, then all of the interesting philosophical questions disappear, and you're only left with scientific questions. Very interesting, valid scientific questions, but ones which are just a matter of doing the hard work of science or engineering to develop a machine that does or does not fit your definition of consciousness. So in that way, my answer is, it depends.
All right, it depends from panelist number one. This is a good start. Right, Anil was furiously taking notes there, so I'm going to ask him to say a few words now.
So I'm going to try not to respond straight away to Blake.
Yeah, okay.
But besides to say, I do agree about definition. I was going to start anyway by saying the definition of consciousness that I think we should work with is probably starting from the folk psychological definition. For a conscious thing, whether it's an organism or a machine, there is something it is like to be that thing. It's not a question of function or behavior or intelligence. It's the presence of phenomenal subjective experience. There is something it is like to be that thing. Now, when I think about can an AI be conscious, I actually get interested in why do people ask the question? What makes them think that this is a reasonable question to ask? I actually think that intelligence and consciousness are doubly dissociable. You can be intelligent without being conscious, and you can be conscious without being intelligent. Why do we have this kind of idea that once things, whether they're organisms or computers or robots, once they get past a threshold, suddenly an inner universe will appear and they will be conscious? I think there are three reasons why we think this. One is a sort of unexamined anthropocentrism, which goes along that we're conscious and we're smart, or at least we think we're smart. And you know, if we look at other animals, some of them are smart, and we don't really know whether they're conscious, but you know, we judge them kind of, their sentience roughly on the basis of intelligence. So intelligence and consciousness go together. That's one reason I think we think that. Another reason is that people seem to be very sort of keen to assume that something like functionalism is true. And this seems to be a relatively popular assumption that, yes, consciousness is a matter of what a system does, its input-output relationships. Now, this may or may not be true. I don't know, but I don't see a good reason yet to assume that it's true. There are some things which, when we simulate them, it's actually doing the thing. Computer that plays chess. Other things that we simulate don't do that thing. It doesn't actually get windy inside a weather forecast, a computer simulation of a weather system. So why should consciousness just be assumed to be a matter of information processing? And then we have things like and then there's an urgency, the singularity. Something is going to happen, the computer's going to bootstrap themselves beyond our intelligence and understanding, and we're all screwed. And so I think these things motivate this question. I think consciousness has more to do with being alive than with being intelligent. The reason I think this is not for some pre-theoretical thing, but if you think about what are the phenomenological features of consciousness, what is our perception for and what is it like, ultimately, I believe it's for regulating the body to keep us alive. That's how we understand what consciousness is like. This leaves us with a question, can you have a conscious machine without that machine being alive? I'm going to say, again, I don't know, but I do think you cannot understand human consciousness without understanding its roots in life, and we'll take that step before we can decide what kind of non-living system might have consciousness. And last thing, the Garland test, I think, so Blake mentioned the Turing test. I love the Garland test. Probably a lot of you have seen Ex Machina. I think he phrases the way Blake set it up beautifully, that Turing had this operationalization of intelligence, and then in Ex Machina, Garland says, he shows them this robot, Ava, this program, says, and the question is like, is Ava conscious? But there's a bit of dialogue where he says, no, the real question is to show you that she's a machine and see if you still feel she has consciousness. And I think that gets at the heart of a dilemma here. It's like, is it conscious, or what does it take for an artificial device to persuade us that it is? And what are the relevant differences between the two situations?
Excellent. Thank you, Anil. Well, the message I'm taking home from that is we may all be screwed. Lisa, you're up next.
Okay, so could an AI be conscious? My answer is, in principle, probably. So I don't see any reason why not. But I think that a genuinely conscious AI would look very different from the AIs that we can currently build. So on my view, I think that consciousness is bound up with features of agency of the kind we find with animals in the natural world. So animals in the natural world not only serve many animals, I think many more than we often talk about when we're in these consciousness discussions, they have their own wants, they have their own desires, they're going for things, they're finding prey, they're avoiding predators, they're going for food, they feel pain, I think. And so I think it's bound up with these various patterns of agential behavior that we find in the world. And unlike lots of other people, I don't think that we should, we can or we should try to reduce those by eliminating terminology that involves consciousness and that involves genuine understanding. So I think what's distinctive of animals like us that have consciousness is that they understand the world, they interact with the world in a meaningful way. And this gives us empirical purchase on consciousness, not as an operationalized thing, but in terms of the what it's like thing. It's much less spooky when we think about consciousness as part and parcel of our meaningful interactions with the world. And so, could an AI be conscious? I think yes. But what it would have to be able to do is it would have to be so embedded in the world in the way that animals are, that information processing is now related to the body and the environment, where you have these new regularities where the agent is properly described as having its own aims, not merely fulfilling its programmer's aims, or in the case of animals, fulfilling biological aims, which very lower level animals and plants do, but they don't have consciousness. But I think there's no reason to think that an AI couldn't do that. Does AlphaGo have consciousness? Absolutely not. Do the current robots that we can build have consciousness? No. But I see absolutely no reason to think that AIs in principle couldn't be conscious.
Excellent. Thank you, Lisa. Well, this is great. We have a probably. We've got a it depends, we're all screwed, and probably. So, Hakwan, what are you going to add to that?
Since you gave me the chance to speak last, I will try to diffuse the question. I'm not a fan of really difficult questions. I think I'm not smart enough to answer them. But I think this question has a variant of can AI be conscious? We can ask a slightly different question that is not too distracting. In fact, it might even help. The question is, let's say tomorrow, all the AI community researchers come out and say, well, look, these models are conscious and these are not. My question is an empirical one. It's not a conceptual one because they are difficult. The empirical question is, what do you think you will react? Are we going to laugh at them, or are we going to take them seriously? I think right now this is a question you can actually predict, and you can be correct or incorrect about, which is I think a slightly better scenario than just talking about it depends, or any other guesswork that may not have an answer. Right now the question is a little bit moot because basically the AI community is not going to come out and make these bold claims. And frankly, partly is not because they lack bravery. I think the AI community have been making very bold statements. But instead, the problem is they don't see the point of talking about consciousness. I mean, some people do, but by and large, it's not the majority of them who do. And when they talk about consciousness, the concept may be very far from what we talk about consciousness, how researchers in neurobiology or community talk about it. But let's say there's a scenario under which the neuroscience of consciousness start to come of age. We start to write down really beautiful, elegant computational models describing how consciousness works in the brain and unconsciousness work in the brain. And even more so, we start to say, well, actually, these models are so clear, you can see how this dual conscious-unconscious architecture of the human brain allows us to do all these wonderful things, these tasks that we can do so well, which is exactly what sucks in current AI. If we are at that position, I think the AI researchers will start to take consciousness seriously, and they might start to steal our ideas from our textbooks to try to build them to their models. And then at that point, you might ask, well, are the neuroscientists going to take them seriously in return? Well, maybe some of them aren't. Some of them are going to think, well, they're just learning stuff from us. We don't have to care about them. But for a neuroscientist like myself, I would start to be really intrigued to go and read that literature, because I can only do so many experiments in humans. But if they have models that are modeled after how the conscious human brain is built and the unconscious brain is built in this architecture, I can play with the models and maybe even generate clinical applications. I think at that point, if we do reach that point ever, I think then we would not just find it convenient to call those models conscious and unconscious accordingly. In fact, we will find it almost makes sense, because those models, in fact, model after how our brain is known to be conscious and unconscious in those specific ways. So what I'm saying is I think it could happen, but if it happens, it will be under some very specific conditions that it requires us to define consciousness in a certain way. So it, in fact, helps to answer the definition questions, too. If we define consciousness as just biological substrate, I don't think that the scenario I talk about would ever happen. Instead, if we define consciousness as something is computationally useful, I think we might have a chance.
Excellent, right. So it could happen. That's what you should take away from that, I think. Now, I'm going to let the panel start a discussion between themselves, give them an opportunity to pick up on any of the issues that have been raised. Before I do, there are seats here in the first, second, and third rows. There's a lot of people standing at the back. If any of you want a seat, please come on towards the front. So Away you go. Anybody want to... Anil, you look like you had something you wanted to follow up with Blake.
Oh, I can always think of, yeah.
We've got several things to follow up on.
Yeah, in a sense, I do agree that you have to make it a scientific question, you have to have a definition. But there is the question of what is the fact of the matter, then it's still there. And it still seems to me that the definitions of consciousness that we're using, that we've explored in the panel now, they come in various forms. There are definitions about the functional capacities that a system might have. There are also phenomenological definitions that seem to be more inscrutable to science. I mean, that's always been the problem. But nevertheless, if you get to the heart of it, that's what a lot of people mean when they think about consciousness. It is really the presence of some kind of subjective experience. Now, it's clear that some systems are conscious and they're made of stuff. I'm a materialist, I think. There's nothing spooky going on. So it's a question of how similar does an artificial system have to be to systems that we know exist before we can ascribe them to be conscious. And I think Hakwan rephrased in a very interesting way, but also raises a danger, which is that we tend, I think, all of us tend to kind of overextend. We like to attribute intentionality and consciousness and mental states and things to things that, in some sense, we already know don't have them. Tamagotchis and things like that. We like we interact with things by sort of enhancing the scope of what things have minds and have awareness. And this is, I think, a danger, because what would happen when we have systems that seem to us, that give us the strong impression that they have conscious states, even if we have pretty good reason to suppose that we understand those mechanisms and we have no reason to suspect they would be conscious. That, I think, opens up, it brings ethics onto the table, and I want to make sure that's there too, because there's an ethical question about what does it do to us to assume or to feel that something is conscious, and that's a separate ethical question from the ethical question of should we be building things with a view to them being conscious, which might introduce suffering into the world, as Thomas Metzinger pointed out in the opening keynote of this meeting.
So the thing I want to push back against is, and this is, I suspect, where Anil and I ultimately part ways, is I wholeheartedly resist the idea that we not only can, but even should consider it a scientific endeavor to try to come up with anything that fits the folk psychological idea or that matches this definition that Anil gave at the start of what is it like to be something. With all due respect, I consider that a non-scientific question. It is, the words are effectively meaningless the way they're phrased. And I can say that AI researchers will never really take seriously an attempt to get a machine for which you can say there is something like to be that thing. In order to render it quantifiable, we will, I think, necessarily have to adopt a definition that does not match our intuitions. And this happens in science all the time. So one of the things that I think we all forget, we discussed this a little bit at the table earlier, is that many of the theories that we now accept as obvious in science were not intuitive for human beings hundreds of years ago. It's only because we've been raised in a society and educated from day one on these concepts that they seem natural to us. The example I always give of this is I remember I took a philosophy of mind class as an undergraduate, and the professor was trying to explain the explanatory gap to the class. And to do that, she wanted to explain a situation where there was no explanatory gap. So she said, okay, look, the difference between solids and liquids, like why is a liquid wet and fluid, why is a solid solid? That's because of, blah, 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 the way the molecules are arranged. And all the students were like, right, there's an explanatory gap there. And she was like, no, there is no explanatory gap there. But it's not intuitive. If you went to someone 800 years ago and you said, actually, this table, there's only tiny little particles with huge amounts of space between them, equivalent to the space between the Earth to the sun. That's not intuitive to them. That doesn't make any sense to them. And likewise, I can pretty much guarantee you that whatever definition science eventually adopts for consciousness will not match the what it is like to be that thing feeling that everyone wants. So I think we have to let go of that and accept that that's just not the way that science operates, and you're never going to get an explanation that can do that for you.
So, well, go ahead. Lisa, yeah.
I just wanted to jump in here because I think maybe I'm somewhere in between you two somewhere. Because I think that Blake is right that there's going to be a lot of conceptual development as science progresses. But I think that we're holding consciousness research and research about the mind and AI to a much higher standard than we hold the other higher level sciences. So generally, if you have very explanatory concepts that help to explain how the world works, we accept those things into our ontologies and we can use them without needing to define them in other kinds of vocabulary. So we don't tie chemistry's hands behind its back and make it use the vocabulary of physics. But that's what people are trying to do when they're describing intelligent behavior in AI context. So they want to eliminate discussions having to do with agency, purpose, meaning, which all involve consciousness, I think. Maybe not the words or what it's like, but if you want a being that can react to its environment in a way that demonstrates understanding the way that, say, a squirrel can. I'm not even talking about humans, I'm talking about animals that clearly, meaningfully interact with their environments. We can only describe their behavior using agential intentional terms. And so I think that a key part of all of this is, although we need measures of agential behavior involving consciousness, we do not need definitions of that behavior in terms that don't appeal to intentionality, agency, and consciousness. And I think that's perfectly fine. It's not incompatible with a scientific investigation in AI or otherwise.
All right, I think Hakwan would like to add something.
Yeah, may I say something? I think I agree with Blake very broadly that some of those definitions are really may not be so congenial at this point, but I have some maybe confusion in myself about what kind is a scientific definition. And just to belie you share your undergraduate experience, let me share also my experience from the kindergarten, in which I remember distinctly being told by the teachers that when she said dolphins are not fish, I was really disappointed. And in fact, I thought I had much better scientific definition, which is that the dolphins look like a fish and swims in the ocean. It's a fish. And when they told me that it's not, I remember being very angry. And ultimately, this is science. I was really kind of pissed off. And I still kind of, in some sense, I mean, you see, I brought this experience because I've never forgiven the teacher. I still feel that, when she told me that is science, that is exactly a very unscientific attitude almost to tell me, like, this is what biologists said. And I come to think a lot of these things that we see as scientific in some ways depends on the community that decide that it's scientific. And of course, we're not going to take any community just seriously. Right, so it ultimately depends on what the community can do for us. So in biology, we know that, well, their overall taxonomy of organisms and the understanding of evolution has done a lot of good. So we decided to put these people into school, and so they can get the channel to educate our kids, and then they get to have their say. And in a sense, I feel that in consciousness research, there is a community here that take what is like the subjective experience very seriously. So to my mind, it's just a matter of whether those guys would actually win out in this race. If they, let's say in next 10 years, if they start to do something that is really, truly amazing, that you AI guys start to say, well, we defer to you. Whatever you say, sir, we'll take whatever definitions you get. I do think that there's a remote possibility that we can put subjective experience on the map.
Can I come in very quickly? Just to think, I'm not sure I'm exactly where Blake thinks I am on this. It's not that I think this is what it is like as a definition that's set in stone, and that we as a community of consciousness science researchers go in and that's what we're trying to find an answer to. The history of science also tells us that definitions evolve along with explanations, and we've seen this in so many different contexts, the gene, temperature, and so on. And in consciousness, I think that it's really just to pick out, don't lose track of the subjective phenomenal aspect. But then what you do is you start thinking, well, how do we start to make this a constellation concept rather than one thing? So there's conscious level, the difference between being awake and asleep. There is conscious content. There's feelings of agency. There's how our perceptual world is structured. And once you start to break it apart that way, you can start to figure, well, what are the mechanisms that make this kind of conscious perception this way rather than that way, or accessible at all or not? And then you can start to, I think, interface very nicely with the developments in AI, and I mean, that's what I'm particularly interested in, because we have a shared interest in things like generative models, and we can understand, well, what kind of generative model might underlie my phenomenology of a visual scene being this way rather than that way, and maybe that's a functionally useful thing. I think it probably is. And then, I think that's the really productive interaction, much more productive than actually the question of, is that model conscious? Because that's a metaphysical question that I don't think we are placed to answer. But the definitions will evolve, so let's not get kind of hamstrung by the definitions that we started out with, because that's what gets us into a problem, not what gets us out of it.
So on that, I largely agree. I think that what I'm ultimately resistant to, though, is any attempt to provide a definition of consciousness or subjective experience that renders it necessarily non-measurable. And if you do that, that renders it a non-scientific concept. You cannot have concepts in science that are, by definition, immeasurable.
I agree.
And so when we then accept that any scientific definition will be one which includes the ability to measure it, I think necessarily we get tied to ideas like agency and behavior and other things where we can do something, we can measure something. And we all know that that's the case anyway. You know, I always think of with the locked-in patients, when we talk about, oh, we discovered they're actually experiencing stuff, it's because there was some behavior, even if it was just neural behavior, that we were able to measure at some point in time. At no point will you ever convince a scientist that something that is completely immeasurable, like there's no measurable sign of any activity at all, that it's experiencing something. That no scientist will ever accept that. So I, for the record, am fully on board with the idea that we should adopt definitions that needn't necessarily be completely reductive. I agree with you that the study of consciousness need not ultimately go down to the particles of physics in terms of the definitions we adopt. But I do think that those definitions have to be a definition that provides a measurable thing rather than an immeasurable thing.
So if we rephrase the question slightly, not to can an AI be conscious, but could an AI perfectly emulate consciousness, does that change all of your answers?
Yes, then my answer becomes yes.
My answer becomes it depends.
My answer becomes probably.
My answer remains unchanged. Are we going to take them seriously or laugh at them?
Very good. Right, why don't we take, we can come back, unless anybody has any burning questions for each other, we can kick it out to the world, or to the people here. Let's start with a question from Twitter. We have something here from Michael in MIT. He says, what are the simplest or clearest examples, if there are any, of a mental process related to consciousness that can be implemented in the brain, but could never be implemented in a computer or an AI? And let's start with Hakwan, but anybody can jump in if you'd like to.
Yeah, I think my answer might share a similar theme. I think to the extent that I'm not sure if there is one, but I think the issue is to the extent that you can now study the brain and write down models, and to the extent that you can actually write them down to a very sufficient level of detail, then of course you should be able to implement it in some computer simulations or even a physically created device. But then the question then becomes essentially, are there mechanisms in the brain that are essentially not studyable at that level? And as a neuroscientist, I just refuse to be so pessimistic to think there is any. I mean, we will never know. Obviously, we don't know the complete brain, but I think we will never give up trying before we get there.
Mine would be different. It's again that for some things, there's all the difference in the world between implementation and simulation or emulation. I don't see any limiting factor on those things that could, in principle, be simulated or emulated, although I did just say it depends. I think it does depend. But I don't see that as being the real hard limit. But to say that what's an example of something that could be implemented is putting the focus on the wrong thing. The question is, can anything, any mental process, if you implement it on a computer, is it actually a mental process in the same way that it's a mental process for us? And I think that gets us back to the question of functionalism, and it becomes a metaphysical question.
Anybody else want to comment? I mean,
I can jump in. I suppose my instinct is that, again, if you're being a good neuroscientist, your experiments are going to ground out in behavior. So ultimately, what you're going to be studying is the circuits that allow for some behavior to occur. And once you have made clear what behavior you're studying and what computational operations need to occur for that behavior to unfold, then sure, it's just an engineering problem to get an AI to do it. And so in that way, no, I don't think there's ever been anything that has been identified by neuroscientists to date that a computer couldn't do.
Yeah, so I think I agree. The one thing I would add is that we already know that even for very simple nervous systems, there are causal variables that operate at very different spatiotemporal factors. So for example, dopamine regulation in the brain, for example, is something that radically changes what certain circuits do, how they function. And that's something that current AI systems just don't really take into account, different spatiotemporal scales in the brain. And so that's not an in principle thing, but I think that as a matter of fact, AI systems don't take into account the kind of spatiotemporal complexity overlapping that we find in the brain, especially as you relate it to behavior. So I think AI systems would have to get very much more complicated before they could implement anything like consciousness.
All right, excellent. So I have a question here from Bjorn at the University of Oslo. Hopefully he's tuning in. It's probably a bit early in the morning right now. So Bjorn says, other than the fact that humans are both relatively intelligent and conscious, what other evidence do we have that consciousness and intelligence are related? Are there any intelligent behaviors that are likely to be performable unconsciously by humans? And this morning we heard a keynote from Lisa, so I'm going to ask her to comment on that. The keynote was about consciousness and intelligence. So do you want to kick off with that one?
Sure, thanks. So I think the term intelligence gets bandied about, and it gets used in different kinds of ways. And so there's what's called artificial general intelligence, where you have a system that acts in a more general purpose way as opposed to the specialized AI systems that we currently are better at building. And then there's human level intelligence, where you have systems that can perform functions at or above the level that humans can. And often when people talk about human level intelligence, they often talk about it for specific things like playing chess or Go or something like that. But then there's what I like to call minded intelligence, which is intelligence in the same sense that you or I have it, or that a squirrel or a dog does. And a squirrel can't play Go, but it understands its world in a way that AlphaGo can't. And so that kind of intelligence, I think, does inherently involve consciousness, and I think it's a kind of intelligence that we so far have utterly failed at building, mainly because we haven't been trying to build systems that have minded intelligence. So this is related to the frame problem for artificial intelligence, which is the problem of how do you build a system that uses information that's relevant to the task that it's supposed to perform, and ignores information that's irrelevant to tasks that it's going to perform. And relevance is a semantic notion. It's involved in the world of meaning, of understanding the world that you're interacting with. And I think that current AI systems try to substitute discussions of relevance for discussions of properties that are formal, that can be specified independently of semantic notions or concepts. And so when I think that if you take into account the idea that beings that have minds like us meaningfully interact with the world in a way that we aren't studying yet, that notion of intelligence is bound up with consciousness inherently, I think. So if you study the one, you're going to study the other.
Now, Neil, in your introduction, you said that something could be intelligent but not conscious, and conscious but not intelligent. Now, is that simply because it depends what intelligence is and it depends what consciousness is, or is there something more to it?
I just think that they're pointing at different things. I mean, for us, they tend to go together, and there may be an empirical correlation between intelligence and consciousness in the natural world as well. I agree with what Lisa says, actually, about the kind of intelligence that's an embodied embeddedness with the world is the kind of intelligence that was more likely to be associated with awareness in general. I think intelligence gives us new possibilities for kinds of conscious experiences. So I'm always drawn to the example of, like, I can be sad if things are bad. I can be disappointed if I expected things to be good and then things are bad. But to feel regret, I need to have enough intelligence to entertain a counterfactual that I thought things were going to be good, they're bad, but if I'd done X rather than Y, they might have been good. And I can even suffer and often do anticipatory regret, which is that, I know it's going to be bad if I do X, but I'm going to do X anyway, and it's bad. And, you need a non-trivial amount of kind of counterfactual mental time travel and all this to expand your range of conscious experience. So I'm not saying that they're independent, but they are nonetheless, I think, doubly dissociable. And I do think the reason we tend to associate them comes back to this anthropocentrism and an acceptance of functionalism as a kind of given, that computers can do anything.
I mean,
sorry, go ahead. Brian.
sorry, no, please.
Yeah, it seems to, actually this question is very good. I think it also ties to the last question to some extent. I think there's a very, Anil was being very right to try to point out that, assuming that it would, the brain functions are ultimately computational and is close to something intelligent is an assumption. But I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to that assumption, not in a metaphysical sense. I'm just thinking how things would go. So to the extent that Blake also pointed out, if we are good neuroscientists, given how neuroscience is going, to the extent you try to understand a mechanism, you understand it almost as a form of intelligence, as a computational algorithm. This is our understanding. I mean, just mapping out the molecules don't help you very much. You really want to write them down as a model. This is the mechanism that regulates certain bodily thing. It can be about the body, it can be about the living organism, but ultimately is a mechanism that we can write out as an algorithm. To the extent that it is, in some way, to the extent that neuroscience can ever inform the AI research of consciousness, it will be in the form of something like intelligence. And so it kind of relate to the last question. There might be things in the brain that are ultimately beyond that, but I'm not sure that would ever make it to the AI side.
Right. So what I wanted to comment on was that intelligence, I think, like consciousness, is a kind of slippery term. And, I think it's important to recognize that within the AI community, there's actually an operational definition of intelligence that has been adopted largely, and which is perhaps unsatisfying to some AI researchers. But it relates to this concept that Yoshua Bengio and Yann LeCun came up with of the AI set. So the idea of the AI set is basically what are the set of tasks, of problems that we want computers that we're going to call artificial intelligence to do. And they suggested that the AI set is basically all the stuff that animals and people can do. Now in that case, if we define intelligence as basically behaving like animals and people, then I think necessarily consciousness will be so correlated with intelligence that they will be forever intertwined to some extent. They might not be completely parallel with one another. There might be some systems that we would accept as being conscious but less intelligent, and but I think that's maybe again a question of definitions. But I do think that one of the things that we have to appreciate is that the entire endeavor of artificial intelligence is, in fact, to create machines that act like us. And if we do that, then I think we will have both intelligence and consciousness in all likelihood, regardless of what definition we end up adopting.
Okay, so let's move into a slightly different territory now. Let's talk a little bit about ethics and the sort of ethical problems. I know that's something that many people think about and are worried about when they start to think about whether machines will become conscious and take over the world and kill us all and things. Have I oversimplified that?
We're all screwed. I mean, that's how we started, so... No.
So we've got a couple of sort of questions that touch on ethics. So let's do that. So I have one here. Let's start with Johannes in the Netherlands, who says one of the most impressive feats of the human mind is that it can come up with new solutions or behaviors that no one would have predicted. If AI could be endowed with this ability, would such unpredictably not pose a huge potential threat to us? Who wants to kick off with that one?
Okay,
Certainly.
Sorry?
Certainly. Maybe
Certainly.
already did.
Right, we've got a certainly at this end. Do you want to respond to certainly, Blake?
Well, I just want to say we've already got AI that behaves in ways that we didn't predict. AlphaGo came up with moves that people weren't anticipating. So to some extent, the answer is definitely we've already got AI that does that.
Right, but I would just add that the unpredictability is circumscribed, and we have reason to think that it's circumscribed. So we know enough. We don't know exactly how AlphaGo or AlphaGo Zero works, but we know enough to know that the reason why it's coming up with unpredictable moves isn't going to lead to a robot apocalypse, right? It's not going to take over the world. And so I think there's a distinction between the kinds of unpredictability that we can circumscribe, that we feel like we don't understand exactly why it's doing what it's doing, but we know the boundaries of it. Whereas there are other kinds of unpredictability where we may not know that, and that we do have to keep an eye on, I think.
I just say that the unpredictability that can ripple out beyond the thing itself, and I think that's what we're already seeing too. So we've seen this with search engines in social media, and with things that we're very familiar with. These are examples of machine learning that are having highly problematic effects on society, and that they're already there. So I think sometimes, to an unnecessary extent, the question of ethics gets hijacked by these Terminator scenarios, where there are clear and present ethical problems with machines that Blake built last week, possibly, or possibly didn't.
Yeah, so there are two levels to this problem. I mean, the first one is that the ethical questions are exactly the same as the title of this debate, can an AI be conscious? Because if the answer to that is yes, then we do have ethical problems, because we have ethical problems with the unpredictability of humans on this planet, yes. And then we would therefore have exactly the same problems with AI. But then what you've just added to that, Anil, is that, and Hakwan, is that we're having problems anyway, and maybe it doesn't really matter whether they're conscious or not. AI is producing problems.
Well, I think it does matter. I mean, there's not. It's I think awkward to put a hierarchy. They're all massive concerns. Just some of them are already with us, and I do agree with Thomas Metzinger. I mean, despite me seeing no reason why a computer should be conscious, however functionally capable it is, I do still think that's something we should be concerned about, because should it happen, I might not be right, then that would be an ethical catastrophe, because we would have introduced a whole massive new potential for a very large amount of suffering that we might not even know exists. So these things have to be on the table, even if they're very remote possibilities.
I want to follow up on the comment of circumscribed unpredictability, because I think one of the things that I actually think is funny about these questions is that when you're engineering an AI system, you're right, you can kind of have a sense of what the boundaries are of its unpredictability, as it were. But I would argue that the same holds for humans. And I would argue that, in fact, humans, unfortunately, that boundary crosses over into some really awful behaviors. And I'm actually far less worried about the ethics of AI than the ethics of people, because I think that we can probably create boundaries for that unpredictability in AI that are far safer than the boundaries that exist for Homo sapiens.
In fact, that we know we have certain cognitive deficits that we find we struggle to deal with. We can't think long time horizons despite climate change. You have a system, that's not subject to the same cognitive limitations that we know we're subject to but can't escape because of who we are. So there are actually ethical opportunities for AI, not just ethical perils.
I agree.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think we already, with our AIs that are not conscious, that are not intelligent in this sort of big I sense, already we have very serious ethical issues because humans are using them for bad purposes, right? So think about big data and the ways in which certain governments are using big data to keep track of their citizens. I think these are huge ethical issues that have nothing to do with capital I intelligence or capital C consciousness. And honestly, I think although we do need to keep some of these scenarios on the table, the actual scenarios that we are currently facing are far more pressing and deserve our attention, much more than the potential possibility of conscious AIs or the singularity.
Okay, good. Well, it's sort of related to that. We have a sort of a live question here, so I'm going to put it out. And this, where is it? Sorry. Okay, so this one was specifically for you, Blake, and it's very closely related to that. But it was about your comment about folk definitions of consciousness, right? And this is from Cecily in London in the UK. And she says, given the ethical implications of artificial consciousness, isn't it problematic, even if this is useful for AI research, to use a non-folk psychological notion of consciousness as our operational definition of consciousness?
So it's ethically problematic because why? Like, I'm actually having trouble following the logic to some extent. Because if we adopt a non-folk psychological definition, then I think what will happen will be that over time, if that definition turns out to have explanatory power and allow us to do good science, then we will adopt it into our culture and it will become part of the way that we think about ourselves. And yeah, we might change the way we think about ourselves. Will that necessarily be a bad thing? I don't think necessarily. It will depend on what that definition turns out to be. And I suspect that it could end up being even better, because I think that many of the folk psychological definitions of consciousness that have existed, they haven't always called it consciousness, but the folk psychological definitions of, you know, subjective experience that is worthy of ethical consideration that have been employed throughout history have often been terribly unethical. That's why we as a society today are much more concerned with animal rights than previous societies were. So I suspect that rather than it being something that will lead to a lack of ethics, it might actually lead to greater ethics, because it will remove some of the sort of funny play that people do take with the idea of conscious and subjective experience.
Lisa, you look like you want to
Yeah,
come back.
so I do have some concerns here about when we use terms like consciousness or intelligence in different ways, and we aren't clear about what we mean and what the distinctions are. So something that came to mind when I was hearing Cecily's question is there are lots of examples of over-sexualized feminine robots, and these are becoming increasingly prevalent. And I think when we talk about consciousness sort of in the abstract, or we're talking about AI programs, it's one thing. But when we start to talk about humanoid robots and we talk about what we mean by consciousness and how it is or isn't permissible to interact with beings that are conscious, I think we get into really slippery ethical territory really quickly. And I think we have to be very careful. So I do think that there is an obligation to use terms that at least people will be clear about. And the term consciousness has common sense connotations, whether or not we like it. So if what we mean is really not consciousness in its relationship to the what it's like sense or the meaning sense, we should use a different term, because otherwise I think we can easily permit treating classes of robots and people in ways that are highly unethical.
Yeah, very much agree. And in fact, I think this is where the current community of the neuroscience of consciousness people are going to have to hold the fort. Because I can see from the AI point of view, I mean, it's not to say AI researchers aren't good people, but I think it's just a very objective of the industry, of the discipline, is to build, you know, algorithms that work, that can do things that are efficient. So I can see that for you guys, you will be quite easily, quite happily move away from the definition of subjective experience, etc. But fortunately, there is a community of researchers in psychology, in neuroscience, who are more tied, because we're actually driven by the very definition, the folk psychological concepts. So I think to the extent that we are holding the fort, if you do the science right, we might be able to write down some computational models that you guys can use that would preserve these intuitions. So it's really on our shoulders.
Yeah, I'm kind of with Cecily from London on this one. I think that, you know, if you define or redefine consciousness so that it doesn't in any way necessarily involves phenomenal experience, well, then your ethics and morality become ungrounded, because morality and ethics are grounded ultimately in whether they create changes in people's experiences of suffering or opposite of suffering. And so I think that does raise issues. But then I think Hakwan's also right that then it's the job of the neuroscience of consciousness not just to stick with this folk psychological starting point, but translate it into things that explain these kinds of conscious experiences that then can relate to the systems that you're building. But yeah, if you say we're now only going to talk about consciousness in functional behavioral terms, then you're taking a large ethical risk, because what if it's not just a matter of that?
So if I might just respond to that quickly, because I think there's some interesting points circulating here. I suppose my instinct is that far from making it likely that we will be less ethical, it will make it more likely that we will be more ethical. Because if we adopt a definition that, like, let's agree perhaps that morality would have to do with something like we want to give agents that experience pleasure and pain more pleasure and less pain, or something like that, right? Some kind of Epicurean concept of the world and of ethics. Then I would argue that what's going to happen if we adopt some kind of operational definition that's related ultimately to functional behaviors and stuff like that, is that we are going to extend our ethical considerations to not just animals, but agents and other creatures that we would previously not have extended it to. Because we will no longer assume that there is some magic sauce in a person that renders them worthy of ethical consideration that doesn't then exist in other agents.
So there's a related question here, funnily enough, from, we'll just throw in, we'll carry on with this for another 5 minutes, but this is from Lachlan in Australia, who says, what if we, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, what if we create an AI that we know can suffer? Is that then an ethical dilemma to create a being, if you like, or create something that can suffer? And a sort of an extension of that, he adds, is what if an AI committed suicide? Would we be compelled to concede that it was conscious? Let's just go with the suffering first. Do you want to go ahead?
I would say this is basically something that I think I personally don't do, and I take some pride in that, but many of you do, and some of you have done it multiple times, which is to have children.
Yes,
you have children,
exactly.
you bring someone into this world, you know that person's gonna suffer at least a little bit. I mean, if he doesn't suffer or she doesn't suffer at all, that would probably not be good for your child either. But we do that. So I think the sheer fact that it suffered depends on the nature and how much suffering that there's gonna be. It's not so black and white.
Go ahead, Lisa, if you want to say something.
Oh, I mean, I was just going to say something similar to Hakwan. So we make decisions, for example, about what animals to bring into the world all the time, humans and also non-human animals. And so I do think that if we had reasons to think AIs were conscious, we should set up IRB review boards for how we deal with them and so on. So there would be serious ethical commitments that we would need to make. But just the possibility of suffering shouldn't preclude building intelligent agents.
I think I disagree with that. I think that the possibility of introducing artificial suffering for the purposes of having some technology, I think the bar would have to be extraordinarily high before that was considered okay. Partly because we just wouldn't really know how much, what the intensity of the suffering would be, and multiply these computer programs, if that's what was sufficient, any number of times. Fortunately, I think there's no possibility of us doing that with the technology that we have. But I do think that we shouldn't do it if we become convinced that we could.
I suppose that I'm more inclined to agree with Lisa. I think that fundamentally there's no immediate reason to assume that these routes have to be barred, but essentially, once we get to the point where we've got AI that matches the operational definitions that we might have adopted and which exhibits behaviors that make it look apparently like an agent that is, not just apparently, that make it an agent that is doing stuff in the world, etc., then yeah, we'll have to think about actual ethics boards and stuff for work with AI. And that does need to be something we think about, though we're probably literally a century away from that.
Okay, so let's open it up to the audience here tonight. There's people jumping up already. I was going to say, before anybody jumps up, let's just sort of round out because I don't want this to just be a debate about ethics, but if anybody has any questions that are from the audience that are about the ethics of the relationship between AI and consciousness, please come to the microphone or wave at Michael over here, and he will come to the microphone with you. Sir, it looks like you do. Away you go.
Yes, now it's on, thanks. So let's ask, people have suggested that suffering is probably sufficient for being a subject of moral consideration. But I ask you to broaden your scope and think about the possibilities of what artificial intelligence might be. I mean, in some sense, artificial intelligence is almost certainly possible. We could build, if we end up building artificial brains, we'll have artificial intelligence. I mean, so you're thinking probably in terms of electronic, computational technology, but it might take a very different form. And I ask you to also think a little bit more about the range of considerations that make something morally significant, of which our capacity to suffer or feel pleasure may be just a special case. Maybe that's part of our anthropomorphizing too. And if this panel were to take place in ASSC 74 or 73, 50 years from now, and one of the people on the panel might be artificial, they might say, well, we have no kids. You can just endow some artificial one. Yeah. Is there some? Might that participant say, "You're just being, meatheads. You're assuming that this capacity to suffer is the only thing that gives me moral standing." Yes, I don't do that, but I am, and then fill in the blank, such that I deserve equal moral respect. So that's the question.
All right. Who wants to begin?
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think one of the, I think it's the old adage of mistaking a failure of imagination for an insight into necessity. And one of the things we get stuck in is assessing conscious status and intelligence status by similarity to us. And you're absolutely right. I think my colleague and friend in London, Murray Shannon, had a paper called Conscious Exotica. And just the space of possible minds that could exist is vast. We're one tiny region of this. And this is, I think, one of the great benefits of doing this kind of research, is to endow us with a certain humility that we mightn't otherwise come across. Our place in the universe is geographically small. It might also be mentally small. It might be small in terms of the range of possible conscious experiences that could ever be. It's very hard to know what to do about that, though, isn't it? I mean, it's very hard to until we have a satisfying theory of what is necessary and sufficient for consciousness that could allow us to at least make predictions about conscious experiences that we cannot have. We already come up against this with Tom Nagel's whole thing about what is it like to be a bat. I mean, we need to be able to make some inferences about what the space of non-human conscious experiences, and to sort of restrict that space to the space that we have personal phenomenal contact with, I think, is certainly an issue.
One of the things I guess I hesitate, though, in accepting that idea is that it strikes me that when we talk about immorality, typically, like I guess my instinct whenever we attempt to take on the semantic definition is, I ultimately, to the extent that I adhere to any philosophy, I adhere to kind of later Wittgensteinian concepts of meaning. And I feel like we have to adopt use definitions. And so people use, the word immorality or unethical to mean that which induces suffering, typically. And in that sense, I don't think it's actually possible to have a creature that doesn't suffer, that is still worthy of ethical consideration. Because I think that once it no longer has suffering, it no longer actually meets our usage of the term unethical.
So I think I want to make 2 points. So the first one is that I think it's a good idea to broaden our conception of both suffering and satisfaction. So I think it's totally possible, so we know that there are cases of human beings who don't feel pain, right? And so at least the physical pain from interacting with things, right? But they still suffer, right? And why? Because they have they have desires, they have aims, they have plans for their lives. And so although there could be intelligent agents that are very different from us, that want very different things and are doing very different things, I think they would still have not only suffering, which is the negative side, but also the positive range of experiences that go along with having meaning to your life, having life plans, accomplishing certain goals. And so although it might be difficult for us to understand why they have the goals that they do, I think some notion of satisfaction along one dimension and suffering along another dimension is part of what makes for a conscious agent. Now, the second point is that in many traditions, especially lots of Eastern traditions, there's this notion of a pure consciousness that is completely detached from thought or from agency. And I think it's an open question whether there could be such a being. I think it would be very difficult to get an empirical purchase on such a being, but I don't want to rule that out sort of conceptually. I think it's metaphysically possible. And so I think it's possible, at least conceptually, for there to be a being that doesn't suffer at all. And I'm not sure I would want to take such a being out of the ethical domain. These beings are often, in these Eastern traditions, thought to be the most enlightened among us. and so I think we should be careful when we think about what beings are subject to ethical considerations.
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with you. I really like the question too, Bob. I think I have to confess one thing, which is I am not a very ethical person in general. I try, but I think like many of us, we know that we don't have 100% ethical hygiene, and in fact we do a lot of things knowing that it creates suffering for other people and definitely creatures. And so in that sense, I think we already agree there is a priority. So my stake in my being here at all is because first and foremost, I want to understand human consciousness. So if there's any reason I'm actually bothered to want to understand AI consciousness, is because I want to do via that help me to understand human consciousness, so I can help with patients and everyday people who may benefit from that. So in that sense, if an AI comes up and say, well, I'm suffering too, but in a way very different from yours, I might want to say, it's not like I completely don't want to care about that, but my priority is not so high. I would care more about the form of AI that would suffer like the way we do, because that ultimately help us. But to add a secondary point, if I can, actually goes back to the last question we kind of slightly brushed aside too quickly about suicide. I think that is actually, we didn't brush it aside because it's not a good question. I think we brushed it aside because it's too much of a good question. It's very tricky to answer. But I think here it might illuminate the point. If you give an AI, let's say that might be a good idea that I'm saying off the cuff, that if any AI develops a certain level of intelligence, and if you give them the chance to turn itself off, and if the AI is saying that I'm going to do that because this is really too much, and I think that would be a good, as a first stroke, maybe a good way to see assess their level of suffering. Because if it's so different from ours, I mean, there's no sense talking to them, how does it feel? There's no sense of psychotherapy and trying to help them. But if it becomes a point that they would say, I'd rather not exist, I do think there's a very powerful statement of protest.
All right, we have another question out there first, and then we'll move to the gentleman at the microphone.
My question's for Anil, and I'll be transparent in that it's going to be, do you agree or not, and why? So at the beginning, you said that why should we think that AI can eventually become conscious, and that intelligence isn't a good reason, and I agree with that. But I mean, in the reason alone that we are going to have to deal with the AI community, and somebody who comes along to says that they did find it in by itself is enough. But I do think there's a scientific reason why AI can become conscious, and that is, unless you think a single cell organism is conscious, consciousness has to come out of evolution. Or unless you think consciousness comes from some other like entity or deity or something like that. So if consciousness comes from evolution, and evolution, the only thing required for that is random mutation and reproduction, then you can imagine that if we just program AI to put in some random mutations every now and then and teach them how to make other AI, then we wouldn't know whether or not consciousness could come from that. I mean, it could, right?
So I kind of agree, kind of not. So I think evolution is very important for understanding the ways in which existing conscious organisms are conscious. In the here and now, we're all shaped by evolution. Everything in biology only makes sense in the light of evolution. Kind of agree with that, broadly. But it doesn't mean that, if I could, this is another thought experiment, that, if I could sort of just replicate all the cells in my brain, and I think only my brain, I think actually only some parts of my brain, somewhere else right now, there would be another locus of consciousness there. The level of detail you'd have to do that is I think, unknown. I'm not sure, but I can't see why the phylogenetic trajectory is constitutively important in the moment for the existence of conscious experience. When it comes to AI and random mutations, actually, when I was doing my PhD, we were working on genetic algorithms, and we used to, evolve neural networks that displayed behavior. It was fascinating. It was fascinating because they often came up with solutions to things that we wouldn't have thought of if you tried to design them explicitly. And it was they served as intuition pumps. The challenge was that we just didn't know how they worked quite often. And so I think you're absolutely right that it makes the challenge of a challenge that AI, I think, faces anyway, whether we're talking about conscious or not, is how do we is opacity. How do we understand the systems? Introducing evolutionary selection might be a very useful thing to do, but it brings with it certain challenges in understanding what's going on as well.
Well, amazingly, that was a question that also came in from Twitter. If we're able to, this is from Chabani, if we're able to reproduce every connection between neurons in the brain, will this machine be conscious? So I think at least tonight we can conclude that Anil Seth is not only conscious, he's telepathic.
It's a first.
You, sir, you've been waiting a while.
Thank you very much. This is a question for all four of you. So let's imagine that the research field comes to a time where we actually know how to build an artificial consciousness. We might at the same time know how to build a philosophical zombie instead, for example. If this is the case, then which one would you recommend we build and why?
Who wants to take the zombie question?
Yeah, so let me start, because if Grace Lindsay's out there watching, she has to take a drink every time someone says the word zombie. So
That's twice. That's twice now.
Everyone say zombie as much as you can. Okay, so I'm going to put my cards on the table here. I think the concept of zombies is absolute nonsense. It is exactly what I'm talking about when I say that you cannot adopt a definition that says, by definition, this thing is immeasurable. And that's what zombies are. They start with the assumption that subjective experience is something which could somehow exist or not exist in an agent independent of any measurable phenomena. And I totally reject that as a scientific concept. It's not useful, it just confuses people, it's a trick of language. So could we make a zombie? Certainly not, because zombies are not a thing, they're a confusion.
I might agree with Blake for a thing. I do also think zombies are a bit of a red herring, because for me though, it's again a failure of imagination, because often the zombie thought experiment, zombie, thought experiment is driven by the idea you're asked to imagine a system with a trillion moving parts that somehow is able to be indistinguishable from the outside from a concept. And the conceit is that this is something we can actually imagine. And it's like, what would it be like to it? We can't even imagine a system with 20 moving parts and figure out actually what it does. How is it possible to imagine what other things would go along when you've got a system as complicated as the kinds of biological mechanisms we have in our brain? So we're asked to imagine these things that we really shouldn't be asked to try to imagine. But that wasn't the question. The question was, if you could, should you? And then I think that, well, I agree, Blake, I don't think that would happen. But if you could, then it depends on what would the balance of suffering or non-suffering or other kinds of experiences that this artificial thing could have? It becomes an ethical, moral question. But and then it's a question also of how it reflects back on us, because if we knowingly populated the world with impossible zombie agents, how would that make us treat other humans? And that's I think you've touched on this as well. This is an overlooked side to the ethical debate. It's not just the question of extending, and this gets back to you, it's like, yes, we could extend our envelope of ethical concern more broadly. That sounds good, but one possible consequence of doing that is that we start to deflate the amount of ethical concern we give to each other, and that might not be quite so good.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I'm glad Anil made the point, because I don't have to make it again. But I would just add, in terms of thinking about zombies, I mean, I also think I'm on the same page with Blake and Anil in that I think when we think about consciousness, we're often we like to think about the example of experiencing phenomenal red or hearing the sound of a trumpet, and it's important to think of those examples, but it's also really important to think about a being that did the very same things that we do on the basis of love, or on the basis, for example, of understanding the suffering that children in detention centers in the US are going through right now. And I think when we think about the kinds of actions we perform, including the kinds of verbal behavior, but in general the kinds of actions that we perform, that in us we take to indicate genuine concern, which involves consciousness, and genuine understanding, which also involves consciousness, I find it very difficult to imagine a being that behaved always and in all respects just like we do, but didn't actually understand what was going on, didn't actually have any sense of consciousness or empathy, or wasn't feeling distraught about what was going on down there. I mean, for what it's worth, I really can't fully wrap my head around that. As a philosopher, I know I'm supposed to embrace all sorts of thought experiments, but I really think it's okay to resist this one.
Zombies. Zombies. It's a really difficult thing. I mean, there are many types of zombies, really. I really
hope she's watching.
Mostly, I'm just trying to...
Hakwan is a zombie, that's what we're learning.
Yeah, exactly. As a zombie, I feel it may be helpful to clarify on the very definition of zombies. Zombies can be referred to one type of zombie, which is the philosophical type that you guys have talked about. And in fact, I'm not sure this kind of zombies are exactly the most common way that we use the word zombie. There are different kinds of zombie, as in B-movies, in which there are zombie movies, and those zombies tend to behave differently from the kind of zombies that philosophical zombies are like. And I think that kind of zombies would answer that question. In that case, I would build some of those zombies to do more manual tasks. And then for something more sophisticated, then I would build non-zombies. And I think, in fact, that actually may not be too far from how neuroscientists are thinking about it. So most neuroscientists reject the philosophical notions of zombies, kind of like we all do here. But we do believe that there are unconscious processing that are quite powerful. And in fact, we might use the word zombie to describe these zombies, as in how people would describe these zombies in zombie B-movies. So I think the question may not necessarily be so philosophical.
So sorry, I do want to follow up on that, because I think that's an interesting point. I think one of the things that we can say is that for many of the tasks that we might want an AI to do, there is no good reason to try to create an artificial general intelligence that we would call conscious to do those things. And it's probably better to just have a multitude of relatively dumb bots that do all the tasks we want. And not only is that probably better from an engineering perspective, but it's potentially also better from an ethical perspective.
Also, can I jump in on this? So, I agree that ethically, where we can build sort of stupid things to do the tasks that we want, we probably should stick with that. But there are many tasks that people are really interested in robotics, where it's not clear that we can build stupid things to do those tasks. So a lot of really interesting applications in robotics now are about terrains that are difficult for animals or humans to be in. So on Earth desert landscapes or very cold landscapes, or we can think about beings on Mars. And I don't necessarily think it would be a bad thing if you built a robot dog that loved nothing more than to save people from avalanches, but it had a super thick, a super hard body so that it didn't get crushed in the same way that biological organisms do. I think although there is the great potential for harm, I don't think in principle the idea of building intelligent and conscious, intelligent in this sort of robust way and conscious systems needs to be a net negative thing. I mean, I think at least in principle it could be a net positive thing. Now, humans are horrible. So what are the actual chances that we would have a world with these wonderful robot doggies? I mean, I think, I think very slim, but I think it's worth taking into consideration that there are real benefits of building genuinely conscious robots.
Right, that was a great discussion. I can report from our live Twitter feed, Blake, that Grace Lindsay is viewing from London.
Sweet.
I suspect viewing face down on the floor.
We just
at this
lost
point,
one.
Well done, everybody. All right, we have another question there.
Hi, this one goes to all of you. If you were put in the ex machina situation and you had a robot in front of you and you had to determine if it's conscious or not, how would you as a scientist or philosopher or just a human being go ahead and test this robot?
This gets back to the definition, though. Like, if I'm a scientist, I'm sorry, but if I'm a scientist, how am I going to test it? I have to have something that I can measure, which is, by definition, what it is to be conscious. And if I don't have such a definition, how am I going to test it? I can't test something that I don't have a definition for.
Yeah, I think it is a big problem. I completely agree with Blake what he said earlier about it's not just there's definition, there's measurement.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Would I measure its phi? Probably not, because I can't measure anything's phi anyway. Can do it in approximation, but try that. Measure its perturbation complexity. I don't know. There would be things to try, but it would be very hard for me to say what the factor of the matter would be. And that's the interesting thing about the ex machina dilemma. It's sort of, you see it's a machine, and the question is, do you still feel it's conscious? So it becomes more an examination of just what triggers your feelings rather than what is the fact of the matter, because we don't have a way of establishing the fact of the matter.
So I think to some extent there is a fact of the matter. So is anyone in any doubt by the end of the movie about whether Ava's conscious? I mean, I'm not.
Yes.
And I mean, I don't think, I mean, this goes back, so I'm not sure how, and clarify this for me, but I'm not sure how you guys can answer that to this question and also deny the existence of zombies. Because to me, these two stand and fall together. So by the end of the movie, I think she's demonstrated the kind of agency, the kind of having her own plans, the kind of sophisticated understanding of the meanings of certain situations and certain kinds of dynamics with other beings that I don't think a being could behave that way without consciousness. And so I think that insofar as those of us, we were, mocking zombies a minute ago.
It was zombies we were mocking.
If we're going to deny the conceptual, if we're going to deny the possibility of zombies, I think similarly, by the end of, say, Ex Machina, we should be pretty confident that she's conscious.
Yeah, but I think the film is designed to lure you into that intuition. I mean, it is designed to make you feel that how many people, by the way, have seen Ex Machina, or are we just all talking nonsense? I think most of you. Those who haven't, spoiler alert. Mild spoiler alert. It's definitely designed so that you feel strongly that Ava is conscious. But it's not the same thing with the zombie thing, I think, because all the hard stuff is, they just say, that's the problem is solved. It's this structural gel or whatever it is that's inside Ava. And you're given just to assume that's enough. what I found fascinating about it, I've watched it like at film festivals and commented on it a few times, and how people's allegiances shift between the characters depending on how many times they've seen it is very interesting. Whether you have a feeling of empathy for the robot and sympathy for the robot is not something, it does change with repeated viewings. And so there was a scene in the film that actually got cut from the final version that was there until the end, and it's real spoiler alert. Well, this isn't a spoiler alert because it's not in the film. But as the film ends, there was this scene where you saw Ava's world from the inside. You saw fluttering vectors around people's faces. Somebody's mouth moved, and there were these low-pitched sort of weird things. And I haven't seen the scene, I've just heard about it, but I think the idea was, given that you're now lured into the idea that Ava experiences things much like the other characters, that it's really not like that at all.
Hakwan.
I may have a quick way, again, not to answer the question, but somewhat to diffuse it. I think absolute questions are very hard. So if you give me a creature or a robot, I may not know how to answer. But if you give me two, and tell me which one of them is more likely to be conscious, or tell me one is definitely conscious, the other one isn't, I think I would have a better chance of doing that. And probably what I would do is I would interact with the creature or the robot and run them through, get them to do a bunch of tasks, and then see how much they behave like they're conscious. So in a sense, I broadly agree with Blake. Ultimately, is really how they behave. Like, given that they're not going to have brains that look like mine, I'm not going to dissect them and look at whether the neural circuitry look like mine. So it would ultimately be behavior.
All right, we only have a few minutes left, so please, let's...
So to follow that, is there one thing that your laptop computer could do behaviorally that would indicate to you that it is probably having some phenomenal awareness, some phenomenal experience, short of wanting to turn itself off?
I might be accused of laptop chauvinism, but I would say no. There is nothing my laptop can do that would convince me that it is conscious. And it repeatedly turns itself off without seemingly autonomously.
What if you opened your document, to start writing your grant, or to continue writing your grant, and it shut down that program and said, "No, Anil, we're playing Pong today,"
Yeah, I would assume somebody had written a clever program to do that.
Now, okay, so I want to follow up on that, because that would be my same answer, is that almost any behavior that my laptop would engage in, my first guess would be that some hacker had taken control of my laptop. Now, the reason is because I know that my laptop's actually a relatively unsophisticated computer in the grand scheme of computers. And so that's slightly kind of the problem of this question, is that you've given us an example where you said, okay, take this kind of toy computational device, and now imagine that it behaves in this incredibly sophisticated way. And everyone's reaction is like, well, no, that's not right. So really what you would want to ask to make it a much more interesting question is, imagine 100 years from now, we have a super sophisticated quantum computer that is basically handling all of the things in our society. What would it have to do to convince you that it was conscious? And for that, I think there are a variety of things it could do, and which maybe even Anil would accept.
It depends.
Yeah, I mean, I want to circle back to something that's cropped up a couple of times because I think it's important. So I don't think that just replicating a brain would necessarily replicate consciousness. So I think it's important that the brain is connected up to a body and an environment in certain kinds of ways. I think we honestly don't know enough about the neural basis of consciousness to know whether a disembodied brain that's completely out of any sort of causal relationship to the environment could be conscious. And I think a similar thing about a lot of the computers that we can currently build. So I think it matters very much for us that our brains process information in ways that are very subtly sensitive to bodily and environmental changes. And that's part of why, for example, the hacker goes in and does something intelligent. The hacker is connected to all of these features of the world in ways that laptops just aren't and couldn't be, given how relatively unsophisticated they are. But in order to have, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't have a computational system that was subtly and deeply embedded in its environment in ways that made us think that it actually could could do things that are similar to what a conscious person could do.
All right, I'm going to take one more question from the floor, and then we'll end shortly.
Okay, thank you. So I have the responsibility of the last question.
Not quite.
Okay. There's something I've not heard, so I want to know what you think about that. We are social animals, and the way you have phrased this entire discussion, you have referred on the one hand to the folk definition of consciousness, and on the other hand, the subjective, phenomenological, experiential, either to diffuse them, make the question meaningless, or to make it that problematic. But the question seems to me what we mean by these two. Let me identify the two for a moment. What we mean by that. You're always referring to a individual, subjective, single person experience. We humans get a sense of ourselves after having get a sense of other people. We live in an interactive society. Is the question, what do I mean when I'm conscious, or is the question, what do I mean when somebody else is consciousness? So are we talking about why do we call something conscious? Remember that humanity for centuries considered rocks and mountains and the sun and as agent with a lot of human characteristic. Then for a while, then this oscillates. Descartes considered its dog.
Question, please.
Right. So the question is that isn't consciousness something we attribute to other people, or we attribute to ourselves because other people attribute to it? Is it really such a subjective experience and not a relational experience in our social behavior?
I mean, there are a range of views on that. I mean, we are social animals, it is true. Some people think that consciousness is constitutively social. Yeah, so they argue that you really can't be conscious without having social interactions. I personally don't think this is the case. I think consciousness fundamentally is an individual thing, but not all aspects of it are. So the way I experience being me as a person is indeed partly refracted through how I perceive you all perceiving me, in some recursively. I think that's certainly true. But is it constitutively necessary to be social, to be conscious? I very much doubt it. And there's a widespread of examples in the animal kingdom. Octopuses, my favourite things. They're not very social at all, not normally. But I wouldn't take that as a relevant data point to the question of whether they have experience.
So I think it's really important that we don't think about consciousness as something that we have only in virtue of being attributed, having it be attributed to us. And I think that's because there's a lot of injustice that can come in how consciousness and other kinds of mental properties can be attributed to beings. And this is sort of what I was alluding to before. And I think in the Ex Machina case, it's part of why and I think some other people resonate so strongly with the female robots in Ex Machina, is that they're treated as though they're not conscious. And I think very clearly there has to be a fact of the matter about whether or not they're conscious, independently of what the men in those environments say or think about those robots. So I think consciousness cannot just be a matter of whether or not other people in your society attribute consciousness to you. Now, there's a question sort of independently about whether you need social interaction, say among animals, in order to be conscious. That's a very different kind of question. I also would probably come down on the no side of that. But that's not a question of attribution. That's a question of whether the sorts of causal dynamics that are involved in when you have multiple organisms. I've been waiting for the orgasm question, but it's not coming.
It's coming.
Sorry.
It's coming. Well.
Okay. Axel, we all saw it wherever you are. We all saw it. We've been...
Why don't we jump straight to that question?
Oh, no.
Shall we?
Oh, my goodness.
Okay,
Are we
this is
switching?
the last
Okay.
question of the night because we need to wind up here. This is a question from Axel in Belgium. No idea who that is, but I happen to know he's in the room. I was tempted to get him to ask the question himself. It leads directly on from Lisa's answer there. What would it take for a machine to be able to experience an orgasm? And I did talk to the panel about this question beforehand, which may be the reason for Lisa's slip up. Blake kindly agreed to lead off with an answer. Why don't you do that now?
So I think, again, it does come down to ultimately measurable behaviors if we're being scientists about it. To give an example, I think one of the funny questions that you can ask yourself is, to what extent can you be, when do you know that your partners have had orgasms, right? I think of the Seinfeld episode where he discovers that actually Elaine had always been faking orgasms on him the entire time. And the reality is that, what it is to experience an orgasm, I mean, again, that, just phrasing it that way is unscientific. You need to give me something that I can measure. And so if you define it in terms of well, it's the release of this particular neuromodulator, then no, we could never make a machine that has an orgasm unless we endow it with that neuromodulator. If alternatively we would define it as something which is a very positive valence, more so than any other event that the creature ever experiences, then certainly we just need to create a creature that has this one particular event that induces greater positive valence than any other. So, I do think it will come down to ultimately the sorts of behaviors and definitions that we adopt for these things. And I don't think it's so easy to assume that we know what it is even for a human being to experience an orgasm.
Do you want to follow, or Hakwan, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it sounds like we're close to wrapping up. I think my answer would be similar, as in I think ultimately many questions comes down to whether you're going to be laughed at or whether you're going to be taken seriously. It's obvious that in this case we are going to be laughed at, but there is a serious line to that too. In fact, I think the question, I think for someone, Axel from Belgium, I presume he knows the literature. Yeah, in fact, there is historical line to that might be interesting. In the, I think, maybe late 90s, early 2000s, there was a philosopher who was in the room, who's no longer here. He actually raised the point of orgasm, not just to be rude or jocular, but really, at some point, it was a very serious case. Can you even think of a system of representation, so it's like a computational system, that can ever represent the content of orgasm? The initial thought was that, well, maybe there was, orgasm is exactly the kind of experience that you cannot describe the content. That is, if I see a glass, the content is the glass that looks a certain way. Orgasm is so abstract that you cannot describe the content. But very quickly, his critics replied that, of course, orgasm has content. I mean, when did you last have one? I mean, orgasm is about certain part of your body, and it's about anticipating certain kind of behavior afterwards, and it has a certain valence. So that argument didn't go very well. And just to give you a hint of who that philosopher might be, for those who are younger than me who maybe didn't know. There was a phrase in a paper in philosophy called quine and qualia, which is making fun of the philosopher Quine. So let me put it this way, that phrase also about orgasm became popular within the philosophy circle for people who want to make fun of the guy. We call it blocking one's orgasms. I suppose some of you know who I'm talking about now. Yeah.
All right, I think that's a fine way to end the evening. I want to thank our panelists, Hakwan, Lisa, Anil, and Blake. Thank you, everybody that tweeted. Thank you, everybody who's here tonight. You have 8 or 9 minutes to get your bus, those of you who are going back to the hotels. Good night, everybody.